Welcome to the Berkshires Gone By, history and folklore about the westernmost and most beautiful county in Massachusetts. I'm your host, Brooke. There was once a time when western Massachusetts was terribly wild. The borders between Vermont, New York, and Massachusetts were hotly contested ground. The French held the land to the north and wanted the area along the Hudson River Valley, in effect to keep the British from expanding westward even further. The two nations fought in Europe, and of course they fought here too. But the Dutch were settling farther and farther north, up along the Hudson River. However, they didn't settle in cohesive units, but instead in scattered farming villages run by one landowner, not their government back in Europe. This meant that they didn't fight as a unit either, so really weren't much of a threat against the French or English. More of an irritant, as their settlements kept popping up all over, like just over the Taconic Mountains in New York State, and just up the line in Vermont. But wait, before I get any further into this episode, I must first apologize. The story I'm about to tell is a story with a lot of meat on its bones. This being regularly a 20 to 60 minute show, I'm going to have to abbreviate, and that's why I'll say now that I hope you're inspired enough by this topic to read further on your own. There's so much more to find out. Now, back to our story. The French had made some frightful friends. Just about every tribe but the Mohawk had befriended the French. The French didn't require the natives to change their ways. They converted many of them to Catholicism by intermarrying and sending missionaries to live among them and learn their languages and ways. The French traded readily for goods and gave French goods back. The French army honored their native friends by often donning native dress and war paint during battles, and even using some of their fighting styles, instead of lining up in rows like the British still did, which made them easy targets. The English, on the other hand, were much stricter. They wanted the natives not only to convert to Christianity, but also to change their ways completely, and essentially become English. In fact, it seemed that the only reason the Mohawk of New England sided with the English instead of the French was because Samuel de Champlain, a French explorer, killed 5 Mohawk chiefs, despite their shared disdain of the French. It would be an exaggeration to say the Mohawk befriended the English. Rather, they agreed to not attack English settlements and not help the French fight. A few did fight on the side of the English, but those numbers were very low. Finding it hard to win allies, and finding the Dutch a constant nuisance, the English decided to try another strategy, and built a chain of forts and blockhouses roughly along the northern border of Massachusetts, and a few in other sensitive locations in the state. Captain Ephraim Williams was put in charge. Fort Massachusetts, the site of which is in modern-day North Adams, Massachusetts, but was on land then called East Hoosick, was constructed in 1745. It was set just south of the east to west running ancient Native American road called the Mohawk Trail. Just opposite the trail, from a ledge that would come into play later, and just a little north of that ledge is the border with Vermont. It was ordered built along with the others by the then governor of Massachusetts, William Shirley. At this point, the Hoosick River runs along the Mohawk Trail, but dips deeply to the south in this area before coming back north, thus creating a horseshoe-shaped curve of the river. This, in effect, acted like a moat around the fort, the river offering protection on 3 sides, all but the north side, which faced the trail, and on which the great gate of the fort opened. The fort was constructed of horizontally stacked logs, much like a log cabin, and had 2 watchtowers atop the walls. The book Hoosick Valley, Its Legends and Its History says that Colonel John Stoddard ordered the fort to be built 60 feet square, that the walls were 12 feet high and 14 inches thick, and the wood was pine, on a stone foundation, and that it contained a number of barracks that were 11 feet wide, with sloping roofs. Men were often sent out to walk the distance between the fortifications, and hopefully deter trouble. But it wasn't just soldiers that traveled the miles in between. It was also everyday people looking to set up a homestead on the fringes of the British territories. And at Fort Massachusetts there were by this time 3 women, 1 pregnant, and 4 children, along with about 20 men, most of whom were with the militia. In 1746, 2 men, both named John, one a Mr. Miles or Miggles, I've seen it written both ways, and a Sergeant John Hawks, who was in charge of the fort during this time, after Williams left on business, hopped upon the back of a single horse, and began to ride away from the fort, to do their rounds. But as the fort vanished into the distance, natives shot the pair. Sergeant Hawks fell from the horse. Having been shot, Miles, or McGills, who was also hit, was able to hold onto the horse. As the natives ran toward them, Sergeant Hawks was able to find and shoot his own gun, driving the natives off. Both men made their way back to the protection of the fort. The Hawks family seemed unlucky, because just a little while later, a group of men were sent outside the fort to do the usual maintenance, such as cutting firewood, clearing brush that might serve to hide an enemy sneaking near, and gathering anything edible that might be growing nearby. But on this day, the nephew of Sergeant John Hawks, Gershom Hawks, was injured in an attack by natives. The men hurried back toward the fort, the enemy hot on their heels. Snipers up in the watchtowers began to drive the natives away, but couldn't prevent the kidnapping of Benjamin Tainter, or the shooting death of Elijah Nims. He was carried back to the fort and died a little later. The first Englishman killed at the fort. He was buried at the fort's cemetery, with a small stone to mark his grave. Native scouts would climb the ledge just north of the fort and peer over at the activities going on there, keeping tabs on their enemies' habits. This place became known as Indian Point and Indian Ledge, also St. Francis Indian Ledge, as the natives who used this vantage point were those that had been pushed from their homes by this war, and who had taken refuge in the Canadian village of Saint-François-de-Loch. St. Francis Indians, mostly Abenaki, understandably held resentment against the English who had pushed them from their homes. They were happy to journey back with the French who treated them kindly, to fight against their common enemy. In fact, the very meadow, called by the natives the Great Meadow, was unfairly taken from the natives. In 1751, the English had promised to purchase the area, but never paid, and it is said that the Scaticoke chieftains complained that the English were not as good as their word. It was one clear day that Mr. Howland noticed a native cresting the ledge. Howland peered down the barrel of his long gun. He recognized this individual as one who'd given them repeated grief, though I haven't found any actual description of what constituted this trouble. Mr. Howland saw it as irritating enough that from a distance of 60 rods, 990 feet, he shot the man dead. An outstanding feat, considering the inaccurate nature of firearms at the time, but sad all the same. Altogether, things weren't great at Fort Massachusetts. Supplies were running low, ammunition was running out, and the flu, what they called the grip or bloody flux, had taken its toll on a great number of those inside. And it seemed like every time someone would leave to go to the nearest fort to ask for help, they'd again be ambushed and have to scurry back. So it wasn't until a group of 15 men, which included one Reverend John Norton and a Dr. Thomas Williams, came calling, that the terrible state of the fort was really known to anyone beyond its walls. The group had been making the rounds of forts and blockhouses, and had just stayed with Captain Moses Rice at his homestead in Charlemont, from which the military often got grain. If you'd like to know more about the attack on the home of Captain Moses Rice by Native Americans a few years after this visit, please listen to the Berkshires Gone By, Episode 12, entitled Time Traveling the Mohawk Trail. Upon entering Fort Massachusetts, however, they found Sergeant Hawks in charge of a hardly fit-to-serve crew. barely able to run daily tasks. The group decided not to stay the month they'd planned, and all but the Reverend left the next morning, but took with them a note asking for help. It is through Reverend John Norton's writings that we know just what happened that day. The day 4 days later, when roughly 900 to 1,000 French and their Indian comrades, directed by General de Vaudreuil, set upon the fort and surrounded it. They whooped and fired shots for hours and hours. Those inside the fort took shelter in the barracks or ran to the walls to fire back. The attack waned as darkness fell, but the natives kept up their war cries the entire night. Those, sleepless from fear inside the fort, must have talked about the Deerfield Massacre, 1704. A generation earlier, the town was raided, and 9 women, 22 men, and 25 children were killed. 112 others were marched to Canada and held for ransom. Anyone unable to keep up was killed. The town of Deerfield had been fortified, but it didn't save them. And it hadn't been that far to the east, in the Pioneer Valley county of Franklin. For 15 years afterward, the town remained abandoned. And there they were, just a little fort on the outskirts. Half of the fighting men sick with the grip, no ammo, hardly any food, completely surrounded. What were their chances? The feeble groups set up their defenses best they could. The sickest men were given the task of making more musket balls. But really, everyone knew it was hopeless, especially after young Thomas Knowlton was shot through the head while firing from a watchtower. He suffered for hours before finally dying. It had been height that had been his undoing. The enemy had climbed upon the ledge, just the other side of the old Indian road to the north, and from there the inside of the fort was visible to them. Sharpshooters could then rain bullets down upon those who had before thought it safe to venture across the grounds within the walls of the fort. And poor Thomas was suddenly exposed to them as well. Not only that, but it looked like the French were getting ready to set the fort on fire. However, they were kind enough to give those inside one last chance. General de Vaudreuil promised to treat the English with respect if they gave up peacefully. Sergeant John Hawks went back inside to talk it over with the others and to draw up a plan. What he emerged with a few hours later was a contract, upon which the French general had to agree before the English would give in. It stated first that the English would be the prisoners of the French and not the Indians, that children should not be separated from their parents, and that they should be exchanged back to their own side at the first offering of payment of ransom or the like. A note should be left behind for any English who might come looking for them, and that anyone that was too weak or lame to travel should be assisted or carried. The French agreed, and entered the fort to raise their flag. It didn't stay up there long, though, as the natives took what they wanted, including the body of poor Thomas, which the English had planned to bury before they were forced to leave. But instead, they grimaced as it was carried from the fort and scalped, a habit that the natives were taught by the English before they sided with the French. The English would pay a sum for proof of the death of an enemy, and recommended that that proof be a scalp, as they tended to dry rather than rot, and so didn't smell when handed over in exchange for reward. Most of the captives refused to watch as the body was then dismembered, in retaliation for those natives that the militia in the fort had managed to kill, one of whom had been a chief who'd been shot through the chest by Sergeant John Hawks himself. Once done taking what they wanted, and looking for any clues of upcoming attacks or plans by the English, of which of course there were none, for Fort Massachusetts had been rather left out of the communication loop, the French took their flag back down, emptied the fort of everyone, and burnt it to the ground, while the remains still smoldered, a note was pinned to a post, telling anyone who came along where to find their friends. But the natives wanted some prisoners of their own. The French had agreed that the English should be their prisoners alone, but after all they'd been through, it didn't sit well with the Native Americans, who became agitated. So the French agreed that the natives would have some of the men to take back to their camp with them, but that the bulk of the group would stay with the French. This was enough to appease them, but those captives that remained with the French feared for the lives of those marched away by the native peoples. Would they be killed? But they needn't have worried, for along their journey to Canada, they were reunited with the natives and the captives that had been entrusted to them. The Englishman, John Aldrich, had been shot in the foot, but was carried into camp by a native man. In fact, everyone who'd been taken by them seemed to have recovered from their illness, and even gained a few pounds from good eating. One woman, who had been given to the natives along with her husband, had been pregnant. She was carried back to the others upon a platform that had been made for her, and which sat upon the shoulders of 2 Native American men, one to each side. Mrs. John Smead gave birth to a healthy baby girl that same night, and the next day Reverend Norton baptized her with the name Captivity Smead on the 22nd of August, 1746. This incident was echoed in 1754, when Susanna Willard Johnson was taken captive with some others from her village by the Abenaki during their attack on Charleston, New Hampshire. She too gave birth on the way to Canada, and was cared for with great gentleness by the natives, and she named her child Captive. On the 15th, the group reached Quebec, and there were locked away in a prison to await an offer from the English for payment of ransom. It wasn't until then that the group began to suffer from illnesses that reduced their numbers to only 14. In 1747, they were finally paid for, and returned to their own side of the battle lines. After all this, it seemed almost silly that in 1747, a year after the burning of the fort, it was rebuilt. But the English had noticed that even though the French had technically won this little notch in the line of forts, this town of East Hoosic, they weren't there very often to try to keep it. So the English just popped back in, threw up another fort, and just like that, East Hoosic belonged to them again. It's this rebuilding of the fort that might explain a few design differences in descriptions. I've read a description where the fort was rectangular shape, 180 feet at the longest side, but the earliest description I've seen, the fort is square, 60 feet every side. Both descriptions say that it had 2 watchtowers. The earliest one I've found describes it as having barracks with salt box roofs against the east and south walls. Yet another description I found says that it had a blockhouse standing in the center of the walls. A possible explanation could be that when the fort was rebuilt, the design was different. 1 year after the fort was rebuilt, there was a span of peace between the French and English. A grist mill and a dam were built nearby, and the road north of the fort, the old Indian path, was widened for carts, and Captain Ephraim Williams was given 190 acres nearby. But later on, another portion of the French and Indian War began anew. Captain Ephraim Williams was fighting at Lake George when he was killed, and Captain Isaac Wyman was given command of the line of forts that included Fort Massachusetts. The fort had been given a few new upgrades, including some small cannons that were mounted in the watchtowers. But all in all, the fort was still mostly undermanned. Then, in 1759, the war was finally over, and the troops pulled out. For a short time, a tavern was operated in the fort blockhouse, which included a few rooms for travelers to spend the night. But as adventurous families moved into an increasingly safer northern corner of the Berkshires, there was less and less need for a fortified structure. The fact that it had been built on a wetland, which was prone to flooding, didn't make its maintenance easy. It was eventually abandoned. What was still of use scavenged from it, and the rest was gradually given up to nature. who was happy to have its marshland back. Clement Harrison bought the land, and as he began to turn it over, trying to drain it, trying to farm it, he began to pull artifacts from the fort out of the rich soil. The area of the fort, surrounded by this horseshoe bend in the river, was afterwards known as Harrison's Meadow. Lifetimes later, East and West Hoosick became North Adams and Williamstown, and the fort was little more than an old story, and some musket balls that fishermen found on the banks of the Hoosick River. Arthur Latham Perry, who wrote the book Origins in Williamstown in 1894, in 1859 planted an American elm tree upon the spot where the fort once stood. Just before that, he and some of his students from Williams College did a bit of archaeological work, discovering a number of remnants from the fort, including the fort cemetery, plus the headstone and very bones of Eliza Nims. These were taken to the college, and a thorough study made of the remains. The Massachusetts Historical Society bought the location of the fort. Construction was begun of a replica fort, which opened to great fanfare and pride in 1933. Nims and his stone were given back to North Adams. It's not known what became of most of his bones, but the part of his spine that had been found to still contain the French musket ball that ended his life was displayed for a long while afterward at the Fort Museum. His gravestone was set like a plaque upon the front of a greater stone monument at the reproduction fort. The American elm planted by Perry, dubbed of course the Perry elm, was allowed to remain. The new fort built right around it. It stood in the center of the parade ground, tall and stately as could be. The original front gate of the fort faced north, but in the reproduction, the gate was built on the south side to face the parking lot and the new Mohawk Trail. It's not like the old one went anywhere. The road to the north still follows the original trail, for the most part, but the Mohawk Trail, dedicated as a tourist route in the 1930s, deviated here and there from the original for ease of travel by cars. Thus the fort became a popular destination and a must-see stop while touring along the trail. Knickknacks and postcards featuring its pictures were for sale in the fort gift shop, and the fort itself served as a living museum. But World War II meant cutting back on travel for most Americans, and the fort began to suffer financially. This meant reduced operating hours, which gave vandals the chance to sneak in and deface the structure by night. Costly repairs, and the seemingly endless task of replacing broken windows, forced the museum's closure. In a last-ditch effort to pay back its debts, it was rented to some entrepreneurs, Robert Lane and his business partner, Albert Hardy, who for a while operated the blockhouse as a restaurant. But the fortified walls surrounding the blockhouse had to be removed due to its growing instability. The restaurant eventually closed in the early 1950s. Another idea was brought to the table. A buyer intended on fixing up the fort and building an additional motel. The war was over, and travel was again a popular pastime, and the rest of the Mohawk Trail was seeing its benefits. If restored, the replica Fort Massachusetts and its museum could see great popularity again. The Historical Society thought that this was a great idea, and sold the fort, or what was left of it. But the plan never came through. Golub Corporation bought the property in 1959 and built a Central City supermarket against the fort's parking lot. It would later be renamed Price Chopper. The blockhouse still stood empty in front of the supermarket for 13 more years, until it was so badly decayed that it was sadly taken down. But the chimney was saved as a monument. Equally as sad, Nims' gravestone vanished. The Perry elm managed to outlast the reproduction fort, but as was the case with most of the monster elms of the Berkshires, it was felled by the blight of Dutch elm disease that hit in the early 1970s, and still manages to kill off many aspiring American elms before they are able to reach the great heights of their ancestors. Another large stone monument was set before the chimney, and a plaque installed. that reads, Fort Massachusetts, with gratitude to the defenders of the fort and to perpetuate the memory of the scene of their struggle in the wilderness. Daughters of the American Revolution mark this spot during the bicentennial year of our country, 1976. Though most of the valuables that had been in the museum were stored in the library for safekeeping, but Nims wasn't done yet. His vertebrae, that contained the musket ball, became entangled in quite a bit of back and forth, even a little scandal and intrigue concerning differing opinions on who they belonged to and what should become of them, among different groups in North Adams, and Nim's family, who gather still in Deerfield each year to remember ancestors buried there, knew little of the infighting over their kin's remains. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on whose side you're on, with much fanfare and much grumbling, in the year 2000, on Veterans Day, that fragment of Nim's spine, including that musket ball, were taken to the Soldiers' Circle at Hillside Cemetery and buried there. If Nim's family ever want that fragment of their ancestor back, they would need to obtain a court order. Back at the site of the fort, the supermarket decided to plop an ugly lamp post beside the chimney, but it also maintained a small park area around the monuments. Over the years, the site has been added to some picnic tables, some flowers. Someone cares. But now things have changed again, and not perhaps for the better. The Price Chopper supermarket has closed, and the monument stands in a mostly empty parking lot. As of 2016, there's no assurance that the site of the fort is safe. It's not town-owned. Anything might happen if that land is sold. There are some Facebook sites dedicated to its preservation, one called Friends of Fort Massachusetts, and another called Bring Back Fort Massachusetts to North Adams. It's frightening to think that this historic location could end up in private hands that may not care to maintain or preserve it. And while we're thinking of ways to save the site of Fort Massachusetts for future generations, there are some books you might like to look up if you'd like to learn more about this fort's history. One is called The Forgotten Ledge of Fort Massachusetts, written by Wendy Champney, which is available on Amazon. Another is entitled The Hoosick Valley, Its Legends and Its History, by Grace Greylock Niles. You can find this book for free on archive.org. I found it for a few dollars on eBay. There is also the book written by Reverend John Norton himself, a witness to the capture of the fort by the French. It's called The Redeemed Captive, being a narrative of the taking and carrying into captivity of the Reverend Mr. John Norton, when Fort Massachusetts surrendered to a large body of French and Indians, August 20th, 1746. It seems that titles of books used to be a lot longer. However, if you'd like to read this book for free on archive.org, you can find it by searching this title, Narrative of the Capture and Burning of Fort Massachusetts by the French and Indians in the Time of War of 1744 to 1749, and the captivity of all those stationed there, to the number of 30 persons. I know, that's a lot of typing into a search, but it's worth it. Saving Fort Massachusetts is worth it. This has been The Berkshires Gone By, created, written, directed, and read by myself, Brooke Grenier, and co-produced by Deanna Garner. You can find us on Instagram and Twitter, as well as find episodes and images on Facebook, or visit www.theberkshiresgoneby.com for all of our past episodes and galleries concerning our topics. We hope you'll join us for our next episode. Thanks for listening.